The last of the flour was a dusty film at the bottom of the sack, and the wind found every crack in the cabin walls. Arthur Vance sat at his rough-hewn table, the cold of the Montana winter a physical weight on his shoulders. He had 24 head of cattle getting thinner by the day, a mortgage payment due in redemption come spring, and a hunger so deep it had become a dull, constant ache. He had built this ranch on a foundation of shame, and it seemed only fitting that it would end in failure. But he was not ready to fail. Therefore, he had saddled his horse yesterday and ridden the 10 miles to town, a place he avoided whenever he could. He wasn't looking for a loan, which he knew he wouldn't get, or for charity, which he couldn't abide. He was looking for help. The only offer came from Mr. Gable at the general store, and it was delivered in a hushed, reluctant tone. "There is one," Gable had said, polishing a glass jar with a stained rag. "An orphan girl, from the coast, Chinese. She's been staying in the back of the laundry, but they can't keep her. Says she can cook and clean for her keep." He had paused, his eyes flicking toward the door as if to ensure they were alone. "Folks around here, Arthur, they're not keen on it. A man alone out on a claim with, well, it'll cause talk." Arthur didn't care about talk. Talk couldn't mend a fence or keep a fire banked through a blizzard. "Where is she?" he'd asked. Now she stood on his porch, a small figure wrapped in a threadbare coat against a wind that made the pines groan. She couldn't have been more than 18. Her face was pale and composed, her dark eyes holding a stillness that seemed at odds with the biting cold. She wore a simple gray prairie dress, the fabric worn but clean. She carried a single small bundle tied with twine. She looked like a gust of wind could carry her off, yet there was an unyielding set to her narrow shoulders. "You are Mr. Vance?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, her English precise, carrying none of the lilting accent he'd expected. "I am," he said, his own voice rough from disuse. "The work is hard. The cabin is small. I can offer a roof, a cot by the hearth, and a share of whatever food we have. Nothing more." She gave a single sharp nod. "That is the arrangement." She did not look at his worn boots, or the peeling paint on the door, or the general state of neglect that clung to the place like frost. Her gaze was direct. "Come in, then, before you freeze," he said, stepping back. She entered, bringing a gust of frigid air with her. The inside of the cabin was one room, dominated by the stone fireplace, a bed in one corner and his table in the center. She took it all in with that same unnerving stillness. "My name is Arthur," he said, shutting the door against the wind. "What should I call you?" "My name is Jing Yi," she replied. It was a pretty name, but it wasn't what he needed. For the ledger, for decency, for some semblance of propriety, he needed more. "And your family name?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her eyes dropping to the floorboards. When she looked up again, her expression was unreadable. "My family name is Chen." The name hitting like a fist to the gut. Chen. Of all the names in the world, it had to be that one. A cold that had nothing to do with the winter spread through his chest. He felt the blood drain from his face, and he turned toward the fire, pretending to poke at the embers so she wouldn't see. He had run for 10 years from that name. He had crossed 3 territories and sunk every dishonest dollar he had into this isolated patch of dirt, all to put that name behind him. And now it was standing by his hearth. He did not yet know that the name was not a coincidence, but a reckoning. For 3 days a fragile truce held within the cabin, governed by silence and the pressing need for survival. Jing Yi, or Miss Chen as he stiffly called her, worked with a quiet, relentless efficiency that unnerved him. She found the handful of withered potatoes he'd missed in the root cellar, and turned them, along with a bit of salted beef jerky, into a thin but savory stew that warmed him to the bone. She swept the floor, mended a tear in his coat with neat, tiny stitches, and banked the fire at night so expertly that a bed of hot coals remained in the morning. She moved with a purpose that made his own weary movements feel clumsy and loud. He watched her, the guilt a constant metallic taste in his mouth. He saw her father's face in the curve of her cheek, heard an echo of his quiet dignity in her soft footfalls. He had known Chin Wei in the California gold fields, a man of profound kindness and unshakable integrity. Chin had saved his life, pulling him from a collapsed tunnel when others had run, and Arthur had repaid him by stealing the map to their shared claim and the pouch of gold they had amassed, vanishing in the dead of night like a common thief. He'd told himself it was survival. He'd told himself he'd had no choice. But every time he looked at this girl, her father's daughter, the lie choked him. Then the blizzard came. It descended from the north without warning, a churning wall of white that swallowed the mountains and then the valley. The wind screamed like a dying animal, and the snow began to pile in deep, soft drifts against the cabin door. They were trapped. The first day was manageable. Arthur spent it reinforcing the cattle shed, his hands raw and numb, while Jing Yi organized their meager supplies. The second day, the wind howled so fiercely that the cabin itself seemed to tremble. The temperature plummeted. Arthur's weakness, born of weeks of poor nutrition, returned with a vengeance. A feverish chill set into his bones, and a cough rattled his chest. By the third morning, he could barely stand. He sat slumped in his chair by the fire, shivering despite the heat. The world seemed to swim in and out of focus. Despair, a familiar companion, settled over him. He was going to die here, snowed in with the ghost of his greatest sin. But Jing Yi refused to let the cabin succumb to the cold or his despair. She found a small bag of dried mushrooms he'd forgotten on a high shelf and brewed them into a dark, earthy tea that eased his cough. She tore strips from one of her own few undergarments to create a compress for his forehead. When the firewood ran low, she didn't panic. She pulled on his oversized coat and, using the fire shovel, dug a narrow path to the woodpile, returning with her arms loaded, her face red from the biting wind, but her expression determined. She was not the fragile girl he had first seen. She was a survivor. She forced him to drink broth, to stay by the fire. She spoke only when necessary, her words calm and practical. "You must eat, Mr. Vance." "The fire needs more wood." "The storm will break tomorrow." He watched her through a fever haze, this tiny woman who worked with the strength of two men. She was her father's daughter in more than just face. She possessed the same quiet fortitude, the same refusal to bend to hardship. The shame in him sharpened into something far more painful, a profound sense of respect for the man he had betrayed, and for the child who now fought to save the life of her father's thief. He was not worthy of such care. When the storm finally broke on the fifth day, the world outside was a pristine, silent expanse of white. The sun on the snow was blinding. Arthur was weak, but the fever had passed. Jing Yi had saved him. Therefore, their first priority was supplies. The cattle had survived, barely, but their feed was gone. The larder was truly empty now. He hitched the sled to his sturdiest horse and made the arduous trek to Redemption. The town was just beginning to dig itself out. The air was still and frigid. As he tied the horse outside Gable's store, a voice cut through the quiet. "Well, look what the blizzard spat out. I figured you'd be frozen solid by now, Vance." Arthur turned. Frank Barrett stood on the boardwalk, flanked by two of his ranch hands. Barrett was the biggest cattleman in the valley, a man whose ambition was matched only by his cruelty. He owned the bank, had the sheriff in his pocket, and had made no secret of the fact that he coveted Arthur's land for its access to the river. "I'm managing, Barrett," Arthur said, his voice hoarse. Barrett took a slow step forward, a smirk playing on his lips. "I hear you're not managing alone. Gable tells me you took on some help. A little Chinese girl." He spat a wad of tobacco juice into the snow near Arthur's feet. "Getting lonely out there, are we? Must be desperate to bring that kind of filth into your home." The men with him chuckled. People on the street stopped to watch. Arthur felt a familiar urge to shrink away, to avoid the confrontation. It was how he had lived his life, avoiding the hard truths, running from the consequences. But then he saw Jing Yi's face in his mind, her steady gaze as she faced the storm. She had not shrunk from the challenge. She had met it head on. Something inside him shifted. He stood up straighter. "She's my hired cook, Barrett, and she's a harder worker than any man on your payroll." The words were quiet, but they landed in the cold air with surprising force. Barrett's smirk faltered. He was not used to being challenged, least of all by a man like Arthur Vance. "Is that so?" Barrett's eyes narrowed into slits. "You'd stand up for her? After what everyone knows about you?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Arthur said, though a cold dread was beginning to seep into him. Barrett laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Oh, I think you do. A man doesn't just show up in a new territory with a pocket full of gold and no past. People talk. Word gets around from the mining camps." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was loud enough for everyone to hear. "We'll see how long your principles keep you warm, Vance, especially when folks remember what kind of man you really are." Barrett and his men pushed past him into the store, leaving Arthur standing alone in the snow, the eyes of the town on his back. He had won the small skirmish, but he knew with chilling certainty that Barrett had just declared a war. And the one weapon his enemy possessed was the truth of Arthur's past, a truth he had just begun to confront himself. The ride back to the ranch was a long torment. Barrett's threat echoed with every crunch of the horse's hooves in the snow. He knew about the gold. He might not know the name Chin, but he knew enough. In a small town like Redemption, suspicion was as good as a conviction. Arthur felt the walls he had built around himself for a decade begin to crumble. He found Jing Yi cleaning the cattle shed, her small frame moving with methodical grace as she forked fresh hay into the empty troughs. She looked up as he approached, her expression calm, but her eyes questioning. He had returned with far fewer supplies than they needed. His credit with Gable had suddenly and unsurprisingly run dry. He said nothing of the confrontation in town. He couldn't bring himself to tell her that his meager act of defending her had likely doomed them both. They ate their sparse dinner of beans and hardtack in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound between them. The shame he felt was a living thing in the room, thick and suffocating. Later, as she sat by the hearth mending one of his shirts, he noticed the small leather pouch she wore on a cord around her neck. It was old, the leather softened and darkened with age. In all the time she'd been there, he'd never seen her take it off. "What is that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She looked down at the pouch, her fingers touching it gently. She hesitated, and for a moment he thought she would not answer. She was a private person, sharing nothing of herself. But something in the tension of the room, in the shared ordeal of the blizzard, must have loosened her reserve. "A keepsake," she said softly. She carefully untied the cord and opened the small flap. From inside she tipped a single object into her palm. It was a piece of gold ore, no bigger than his thumb, but unusually shaped, like a bird in flight. The sight of it stole the air from his lungs. He remembered it. He remembered the day Chin Wei had found it, holding it up to the light with a rare, brilliant smile. A good omen, Chin had called it. It will fly us to a better life. It was my father's, Jing-Yi said, her eyes fixed on the small nugget. He was a miner in the California hills. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. He couldn't speak. He could only listen as the story he had tried to bury for 10 years was spoken aloud by the one person in the world he had wronged most. He had a partner, she continued, her voice even, almost detached, as if telling a tale about strangers. An American man. My father said he was a good man, just unlucky. One day, the tunnel they were working collapsed. My father was outside, but his partner was trapped. My father dug him out with his bare hands. He saved his life. She paused, tracing the shape of the gold with her fingertip. They were close to a big strike. They had found a rich vein. They kept the gold they found in a shared chest, and they had a map to the main lode. They were going to file a proper claim and build a new life. My father was going to send for my mother and me. The fire crackled, spitting a cinder onto the hearthstone. But one morning, she said, her voice dropping lower, my father woke up and the partner was gone. The chest of gold was gone. The map was gone. The man he had saved, the man he called his friend, had vanished. He took everything. She finally looked up at him, her dark eyes holding a deep, ancient sorrow. My father searched for him, but it was no use. The betrayal broke something in him. He lost the will to keep digging, to keep fighting. He died a year later. My mother followed soon after. This, she said, closing her hand around the gold nugget, is all I have left of him. The cabin was utterly silent. The truth was between them now, a terrible, unavoidable presence. Arthur felt as if he were drowning. He could lie. He could feign sympathy and let the moment pass. It would be the easy way, the coward's way he had always chosen. But looking at her face, so like her father's, he knew he couldn't run any more. The decade of lies had to end here, in this room, with her. Jing-Yi, he began, his voice a choked rasp. He had to force the words out. The man, your father's partner, the one who ran. He met her gaze and let her see the self-loathing that was churning inside him. That was me. Her expression did not change. No shock, no gasp. Only a slow, profound stillness, as if a mask she had been wearing had finally dropped. It was a look of confirmation, not surprise. She had known. Or she had suspected. Maybe she had seen the guilt in his eyes from the moment she'd said her name. Before either of them could speak again, a sound from outside shattered the moment. The heavy tread of horses, the jingle of harnesses. Arthur's blood ran cold. He moved to the window and peered through a crack in the shutter. 3 riders were dismounting in the moonlight, their forms dark against the snow. Frank Barrett and 2 of his men. Vance! Barrett's voice boomed, sharp and ugly in the frozen air. Get out here. We need to have a word about your property line. This was it. Barrett was making his move. It wasn't about a property line. It was about destruction. Arthur was paralyzed, caught between the sins of his past and the threat at his door. He had just confessed to a monstrous betrayal, and now he was facing a man intent on ruining him. He deserved it. He deserved all of it. But as he stood frozen, Jing-Yi moved. She carefully placed the gold nugget back in its pouch and tied it around her neck. She stood and walked to the door, her movements deliberate. She picked up a lantern from the mantel, struck a match, and lit the wick. The small, steady flame cast a warm glow on her determined face. She looked at him, her eyes clear and unwavering. There was no accusation in them, only a silent question. Would he face this, or would he run again? She didn't wait for an answer. She unlatched the door and stepped out into the freezing night, the lantern held high. The cold hit Arthur like a slap, snapping him from his stupor. He followed her onto the porch. Barrett stood by the fence line, a crowbar in his hand. His men held axes. "I've had my land surveyed, Vance," Barrett sneered, his breath pluming in the air. "Seems your fence is sitting on my property. I'm just here to reclaim what's mine." It was a lie, and everyone knew it. He intended to tear down the fence and let Arthur's weakened cattle wander into the open, to be claimed by the winter or by Barrett's own herd. Arthur opened his mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. His guilt had stolen his voice. It was Jing Yi who spoke. She didn't address Barrett. She looked directly at his two men, who were shifting uncomfortably, their eyes darting between their boss and the small woman holding the lantern. "There is a north wind coming," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the still air. "You can feel it in the air. The sky has a ring around the moon. By morning, there will be a ground blizzard. Your cattle are up valley. If this fence is gone, Mr. Vance's herd will drift. They will mix with yours. When the blizzard hits, you will lose count of them all in the whiteout. You will lose your animals as well as his." She spoke with an absolute certainty that gave her words immense weight. She wasn't pleading or threatening. She was stating a fact of nature, a truth of survival that every man who worked the land understood in his bones. One of Barrett's men lowered his axe slightly. He glanced at the sky, then at his partner. He knew she was right. They had seen the signs, too. "She's lying!" Barrett roared, but his voice held a note of desperation. He had lost control of the moment. "Are you going to listen to him or to her?" But the men were no longer looking at him. They were looking at Jing Yi, who stood unshaken, the lantern light illuminating a strength that dwarfed Barrett's brutish anger. She had not raised her voice, had not brandished a weapon. She had used the truth. The first ranch hand cleared his throat. "Boss, maybe we should wait till morning, see what the weather does." "She's got a point about the herds mixing," the other one mumbled, not meeting Barrett's furious glare. Barrett saw it was over. He had been undone not by force, but by quiet reason. With a curse, he threw the crowbar into the snow and stormed toward his horse. His men, with visible relief, followed him. They rode away, their retreat a stark and humiliating defeat. Silence descended on the yard. Arthur looked at Jing Yi. She had not done it for him. She had done it for the ranch, for the cattle, for the simple principle of order against chaos. She had defended the place that was, for now, her only shelter. He finally found his voice. "I am sorry," he said. The words were inadequate, a pathetic offering against a decade of deceit. "For what I did to your father, there is no excuse." She turned to him, her face illuminated by the lantern she held. "No," she said, her voice soft but firm. "There is not." She did not offer forgiveness. She did not offer comfort. She offered only the truth. Then she turned and went back inside the cabin, leaving him alone in the cold with the full, crushing weight of his past and the faint, terrifying glimmer of a chance he did not deserve. 3 months later, the Chinook winds had melted the last of the snow, revealing the tender green of new grass. The valley was coming alive, and so was Arthur's ranch. The cattle, now fat and healthy, grazed peacefully in the pasture behind a newly reinforced fence. A small garden, protected by a cold frame Jing Yi had ingeniously constructed from old windows, was already showing rows of hardy lettuces and radishes. The cabin was clean, the larder was stocked, and for the first time in 10 years the place felt less like a hideout and more like a home. Arthur had sold half the herd at a premium price in redemption. The town's opinion, a fickle and powerful current, had slowly begun to turn. The story of how Barrett had been faced down by Arthur's Chinese cook had become a quiet legend, repeated with a certain grudging respect. Barrett kept his distance, his public humiliation having cost him more authority than he could have imagined. That afternoon, Arthur returned from town with a document from the territorial clerk. He found Jing Yi by the creek, washing clothes. He stood for a moment, watching her. They had barely spoken of that night. An unspoken agreement existed between them. The past was a fact, like a mountain or a river. It could not be moved, only navigated. He had worked every day since to prove he was no longer the man who had run from the California gold fields. He walked down to the creek bed. "Miss Chen," he said. She looked up, wiping her wet hands on her apron. He held out the paper. "This is for you." She took it, her expression cautious. She unfolded the land deed and read it. Her eyes scanned the legal language, then stopped at the bottom. There, written in the clerk's careful script, were two names, Arthur Vance and Jing Yi Chen, partners. "It's half yours," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The ranch, the cattle, all of it. It's not payment. A debt like mine can never be fully paid. Consider it the first installment." She stared at the paper for a long time. He could see a storm of emotions in her eyes, things she would never say aloud. When she finally looked up at him, the guarded stillness that had defined her for so long was gone. In its place was something new. A small, tentative smile touched her lips. It was the first time he had ever seen her truly smile, and it was like watching the sun rise after a long, hard winter. He hadn't earned forgiveness, not yet. He knew he might never earn it fully. But as he stood there by the creek, with the deed to a shared future between them, he understood that redemption wasn't a single act of confession. It was the daily work of building something good and true upon the foundations of what had been broken. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.